On the morning of March 19, 2026, a signals intelligence officer aboard the USS Rafael Peralta, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, picked up something on his passive sensor suite that he had not seen in this theater before. Not an Iranian fast attack craft, not a Ghadir submarine running shallow, not the acoustic signature of one of the coastal missile batteries that had been making life difficult for every escort commander in the Arabian Sea for the past 3 weeks. What he picked up was the unmistakable electronic emission profile of a Type 055 destroyer, the most advanced surface combatant in the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, and a vessel that had, until that morning, been reported operating more than 2,000 nautical miles away in the South China Sea. By the time the contact was confirmed and the report reached CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, 2 more Type 055s had been identified, then a Type 052D destroyer, then a Type 054A frigate, then most significantly, the acoustic contact that no one in the chain of command wanted to confirm, but that the data made impossible to deny. A Type 093B nuclear-powered attack submarine, running deep, running quiet, running directly toward the operating area where the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had been holding position for 11 days. China had come to Hormuz. Not symbolically, not diplomatically, not with a statement from the foreign ministry in Beijing using carefully calibrated language about protecting commercial shipping routes and respecting international maritime law. With warships, with submarines, with a naval force that, by the end of that day, numbered 14 vessels and represented the most significant projection of Chinese naval power, beyond the first island chain in the history of the People's Republic. And it had arrived without warning, without announcement, without the kind of diplomatic signaling that great powers have traditionally used to give their adversaries time to prepare a response that doesn't end in catastrophe. The question that consumed every flag officer in the United States Navy for the next 72 hours was not whether China had the right to be there. Under international maritime law, it absolutely did. The question was simpler and more dangerous. What exactly had China come to do? To understand why that question was so difficult to answer, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz looked like on the 19th of March from the perspective of every navy operating in the region. The United States had, by that point, conducted 21 days of continuous combat operations against Iranian naval and air defense assets under Operation Epic Fury. The results had been, by any conventional measure of military effectiveness, extraordinary. 60-plus Iranian surface combatants sat on the bottom of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, most of them sunk in the opening 72 hours of the campaign by a combination of carrier-launched strikes, submarine-fired torpedoes, and HIMARS missiles launched from positions in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. The Iris Dina, one of Iran's most capable frigates, had been destroyed by a torpedo from a U.S. submarine in the Indian Ocean on March 4th, in the first successful submarine attack by an American vessel since the Second World War. Iran's shore-based anti-ship missile batteries had been systematically dismantled. Its air defense network had been reduced from a layered, integrated system to a collection of isolated, degraded nodes that could threaten individual aircraft, but could no longer deny airspace at scale. And yet the strait was closed. Not because Iran controlled it in any conventional military sense. Iran no longer controlled anything in the conventional military sense. It was closed because of mines, because of the 18 to 22 Ghadir-class midget submarines that remained unaccounted for in the shallow, thermocline layered waters of the Gulf, because of the fast attack craft that continued to operate from concealed coastal positions despite repeated strikes on their bases, and because of a principle that every admiral in the U.S. Navy understood, but that the political leadership in Washington was finding increasingly difficult to accept. You do not need to win a naval battle to close a strait. You need to sink one ship. One burning hull in that 6 nautical mile corridor, and no insurer on Earth writes the next policy for the next tanker. The strait closes not by force but by fear, and fear needs only one example. 157 tankers were anchored outside the strait on the morning of March 19th. Brent crude was trading at $114 per barrel. The International Energy Agency had issued a formal warning comparing the current supply disruption to the 1973 oil shock. The German economy had contracted by an annualized rate of 4% in the first quarter. France had begun rationing industrial electricity consumption. Japan had activated its strategic petroleum reserve for the third time in 6 weeks. And the US Congress was beginning to ask, loudly and on camera, how the most powerful navy in human history had spent 3 weeks destroying 90% of the Iranian fleet and still could not get a single tanker through a waterway 6 miles wide. It was into this environment, this precise combination of military success and strategic paralysis, that China chose to insert 14 warships. The composition of the Chinese force told its own story to anyone who understood naval order of battle. The Type 055 destroyers were not patrol vessels. They were not the kind of ships you send on a humanitarian mission or a freedom of navigation demonstration. The Type 055 is a 10,000-ton air defense and strike platform equipped with 112 vertical launch cells, capable of carrying anti-ship missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and surface-to-air missiles. It is, in the estimation of most Western naval analysts, a more capable air defense platform than the U.S. Navy's own Ticonderoga-class cruisers, of which only a handful remain in service. You send Type 055s when you want to tell the other side that your ships can defend themselves from the most advanced aircraft in the world. You send Type 055s when you want to communicate that your presence is not symbolic and that the cost of forcing the issue would be measured not in diplomatic protests but in burning hulls. The Type 093B submarine was a different kind of message. Nuclear-powered, capable of remaining submerged for months armed with YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 500 kilometers. The Type 093B can threaten surface combatants from distances and depths that make detection and interception genuinely difficult even for a carrier strike group with full anti-submarine warfare support. Its presence in the operating area transformed the tactical geometry for every U.S. commander in the theater. Before it arrived, the primary subsurface threat was Iranian Ghadirs. Small, battery-powered, limited in range and endurance, dangerous in the shallow coastal waters they were designed for, but manageable at distance. The Type 093B was not a Ghadir. It was a peer-level threat. And peer-level threats require peer-level responses that consume resources, attention, and risk tolerance that no commander has in infinite supply. Beijing's official statement, released through the Foreign Ministry at Euro 800 Beijing time on the 20th of March, was a masterpiece of diplomatic calibration. China was conducting routine naval exercises in international waters. China had significant commercial interests in the region, including the safe passage of energy resources through the Strait of Hormuz, which supplied approximately 30% of China's crude oil imports. China was committed to freedom of navigation in accordance with international law. China called on all parties to exercise restraint and resolve their differences through dialogue. China did not mention Iran. China did not mention the United States. China did not mention the 14 warships. In Washington, the statement was read by people who understood exactly what it meant. The language about freedom of navigation was not accidental. It was a mirror. The United States had used identical language for decades to justify its own naval presence in waters that China considered its sphere of influence. The South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the Yellow Sea. Every time a U.S. carrier strike group transited those waters, every time a U.S. destroyer conducted a freedom of navigation operation near a Chinese-claimed feature, Beijing had protested, sometimes loudly, sometimes through official channels, sometimes with intercepts and close approaches that came uncomfortably near the threshold of incident. Now China was in the Arabian Sea, speaking the exact same language, and the U.S. was in the position of deciding whether freedom of navigation was a principle it believed in universally, or a principle it believed in selectively, which is to say, not a principle at all. The National Security meeting at the White House on the afternoon of March 20th lasted 4 hours and produced no decisions, which is itself a decision of a particular kind. The options on the table ranged from the diplomatically cautious, a formal démarche to the Chinese ambassador combined with a request for clarification of Chinese intentions, to the strategically aggressive, a direct communication to Beijing stating that Chinese naval vessels operating in proximity to U.S. combat operations would be treated as potential threats and acted upon accordingly. The problem with the first option was that China would ignore it and the world would see that it had been ignored. The problem with the second option was that it was a threat the United States was not certain it was prepared to carry out, and a threat you are not prepared to carry out is worse than no threat at all because it tells your adversary exactly where your actual threshold is. What the United States actually did fell somewhere between these poles and satisfied no one. The carrier USS Abraham Lincoln adjusted its operating position, moving approximately 80 nautical miles further from the strait. The adjustment was presented publicly as a routine tactical repositioning. Every naval analyst in the world understood it as something different. The most powerful warship on Earth had moved away from a confrontation it did not know how to resolve, without escalating into something that no one in Washington was prepared to authorize. The Chinese fleet did not move. It established a holding pattern approximately 90 nautical miles from the entrance to the strait, positioned between the Lincoln Strike Group and the Iranian coastline, not blocking the strait, not entering it, not communicating hostile intent by any definition that international maritime law recognizes. Simply being there, in the geometry of the situation, in a position that any American commander looking at his tactical display could see and could not ignore. The effect on the strait was immediate and profound, not because China fired anything, not because China communicated any threat, but because the tanker captains and the shipping company executives and the insurance underwriters who had been watching the U.S. Navy spend 3 weeks destroying the Iranian fleet and still not open the waterway, now looked at their tactical displays and saw a new variable that no one had briefed them on and no one could explain the implications of. If the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy were now operating in the same theater on opposite sides of the same problem, what did that mean for the liability profile of a very large crude carrier transiting 6 miles of water between them? The insurance market answered that question in 8 hours. Lloyd's of London suspended all new war risk policies for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz pending clarification of the security situation. 2 major Japanese shipping companies announced they were indefinitely postponing all transits. A Norwegian tanker that had been positioning for an escorted transit turned around and rejoined the waiting fleet outside the strait. The count of anchored vessels rose from 157 to 173 in a single day. Crude hit $122. The harder analysis, the one that was happening in think tanks and war colleges and intelligence community conference rooms rather than in cable news studios, was about what China's move revealed about the strategic situation that had existed before anyone fully understood it. China had not decided to come to Hormuz in response to the 19th of March. Naval deployments of this complexity require weeks of preparation, logistical coordination, operational planning. The 14 vessels that appeared in the Arabian Sea had been en route before the Lincoln Strike Group had fired its first sortie, which meant that Beijing had assessed the likely course of Operation Epic Fury, had assessed the likely endpoint, which was an American Navy that had destroyed the Iranian fleet but could not open the strait, and had decided that the moment of maximum American frustration was the moment of maximum Chinese opportunity. It was, in the judgment of analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the most sophisticated exercise in strategic timing that China had executed since its decision to join the Korean War in 1950. In both cases, China had waited for the United States to commit fully to a military operation, had allowed the operation to succeed in its immediate tactical objectives, and had then inserted itself at precisely the moment when tactical success was failing to translate into strategic resolution. In Korea, China's intervention had transformed an apparent American victory into a grinding stalemate that defined the limits of U.S. power in Asia for a generation. The question being asked in Washington in March 2026 was whether China was attempting to do the same thing in the Persian Gulf. The answer to that question depended on what China actually wanted, and here the analysis divided along lines that said as much about the analysts as about China. One school held that China's primary objective was economic: ensure the reopening of Hormuz on terms that guaranteed uninterrupted oil flow to Chinese refineries, which had been operating at reduced capacity for 3 weeks and were beginning to affect downstream industrial production in ways that Beijing's economic managers found genuinely alarming. On this reading, China was not trying to protect Iran. It was trying to end the closure of the strait, and it had decided that the most efficient way to do that was to make its presence so consequential that the United States would be compelled to find a diplomatic resolution rather than continue a military approach that had proven capable of destroying the Iranian Navy, but not of opening the waterway. The second school held that China's objectives were structural rather than situational. Hormuz was not the point. The point was the demonstration itself, the proof of concept, the establishment of the precedent that China's Navy could operate in waters that the United States had treated as its exclusive domain for 80 years, could do so over American objections, and could do so without triggering the kind of direct confrontation that would allow Washington to frame the situation as a binary choice between backing down and going to war. On this reading, every day the Chinese warships held their position 90 miles from the strait without firing a shot and without being fired upon was a day that rewrote the tacit rules of the international order in China's favor. The specific outcome at Hormuz was almost secondary to the larger message being sent to every nation in the world that had been watching to see whether American power in the post-unipolar era was still what it had been in 1991 or in 2003. The third school, the smallest and least comfortable, held that China's objectives were both of the above and something more. That Beijing had made a strategic assessment that the United States, stretched across the Atlantic in its support for Ukraine, committed in the Pacific to the defense of Taiwan, and now bogged down in a Persian Gulf campaign that had achieved spectacular tactical results while producing strategic paralysis, was operating at or near the limits of its sustainable military commitments. And at this moment, this particular configuration of American overextension was the closest the world had come in 40 years to a genuine window for the reordering of the international hierarchy. That China was not at Hormuz to protect its oil supply, or to make a point about freedom of navigation or to establish precedent. China was at Hormuz because it had calculated that the United States could not handle 3 simultaneous crises of this magnitude without one of them breaking in China's favor. On the 23rd of March, 4 days after the Chinese fleet had taken its position in the Arabian Sea, 2 Iranian Ghadir submarines were forced to surface by U.S. destroyers conducting active sonar operations in the strait. It was a significant tactical success, confirmation that the anti-submarine warfare campaign was producing results, and that the Ghadir threat was being progressively degraded. CENTCOM issued a statement. The Pentagon tweeted a photograph of one of the surfaced submarines. The administration presented it as evidence that the campaign was working. 6 hours later, the USS Tripoli amphibious assault ship, traveling at maximum speed through the South China Sea, crossed into the Indian Ocean and altered course for the Arabian Sea. Its arrival was expected within 72 hours. 2,500 Marines of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit were embarked. 20 F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters were on its flight deck. Its orders were classified. The Chinese fleet watched it come. Somewhere in the deep water between the mouth of the strait and the position of the Lincoln Strike Group, a Type 093B submarine ran silent at a depth and on a course that its commander had been given before he left port. Before any of this had reached the front pages, before anyone outside a small number of rooms in Beijing and Washington fully understood that what was happening in the waters around the Strait of Hormuz in March 2026 was not a regional conflict approaching its resolution. It was the first direct military confrontation between the United States Navy and the People's Liberation Army Navy in history, conducted without a single shot fired in a body of water 6 miles wide, over a question that neither side had a clean answer to. The strait was still closed. The tankers were still waiting. The oil was still at $122. And 14 Chinese warships held their position between the most powerful carrier strike group ever assembled and the coast of a country whose navy was on the bottom of the sea, making a calculation that every admiral in every navy in the world was watching with the full understanding that what happened next would define the rules of naval power for the next 50 years. The USS Tripoli was 72 hours out. The clock was running.